Hi everyone, this is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Okay, let's move this a little bit. Okay, so on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about Santosha. We could describe this in yogic practices as the sensation of feeling at ease, or what's the better way to describe this? Content, probably, and not really desiring anything, and just being at peace with where we're at in our life, and really around not wanting more or not desiring more in our life. And I think that probably more than ever in human existence, this could be more challenging than previously. People's lives nowadays have a lot more options than what we would have had maybe even 50 years ago, but definitely over 100 years ago, especially if you think about obviously the way we're connected with the internet. We have so much more access to travel, and also just with our working environments. Traditionally, a lot of cultures which still happen these days, you would have grown up in your family business, and this would have just been inherently what you would have done as traditions were passed down, and really just wouldn't have so many options available to us. So I think nowadays we have so much available to us, and it's quite easy to not feel content and to think that the grass is greener on the other side, and by having more and doing more and wanting more, that this is going to make us happy. And I'm going to try and break this down a little bit from a Buddhist perspective today, and also just from my own experience of practicing yoga for many years, and just what I've learned around letting go, and really the deeper aspects of letting go, and what I think that this teaches us from having an authentic yoga practice. So let's just stay with just modern living, really. I think this is important. Options definitely changes our sensation of feeling content. When we have more things available to us, and we're seeing more things that are available to us, the mind will start to project and think ahead, and start to think about, oh, but maybe this is better, I can have this. And inherently, I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think it just engages that part of our brain that is comparing and likes to kind of assess whether, what we have is enough, and whether we can have more, and that will make us happy, especially with social media. I'm not going to go too much into that. I think some of that's quite obvious when we have lots of aspirational things thrown in our faces, potentially on a daily basis, where we're seeing influencers and people that have perfect bodies and perfect features, luxury lifestyles, luxury cars, luxury living, and we start to compare. And we assume that this will make us happy because this is desirable in some ways. And I think this is really kind of statistically proven that beyond a certain amount of financial security, people aren't inherently happier. There's a certain level of money, I think, that just gives us some ease and takes away some stress in our lives, where we feel more secure potentially. But, beyond a certain amount of money, I would say that also knowing people, different people I've met through the years who have a lot of money and don't, I wouldn't say they were inherently happier people. We all have our same stresses and our same worries. I think that we experience those in different ways. When we have more, there's more to lose potentially. But I think a certain amount of money definitely gives us some security and some ease, where we're not having to stress each month. I think we all would like to feel that way in our lives, but I think happiness is not intrinsically linked to having more wealth and potentially more money. So I think Santosha, feeling content and feeling grateful, I would say, is probably a better word, is something that you can practice. I think you can definitely practice daily feeling comfortable and feeling grateful for the things that you have. And most people, when you look at your life, even if you're a very goal-driven person, most people I would say I've met, and from my own experiences, really have achieved the things that you've set out to achieve. I'm sure if you looked at your own personal life right now, most of us would say that we actually achieve the things that we set out to, and we're actually living a life that we set out to live. I think most people do experience that, and I'll break that down a little bit more in a moment. But let's look at the word Santosha, the Sanskrit word Santosha. So if we have a look at the dictionary and we look at the word Sam, which means completely or altogether, could be another, or entirely, and we look at the word Tosha, which we could describe as being content or satisfied, and accepting. Yeah, I think accepting is probably a good word to bind these words together. So really, we're talking about being completely content or satisfied. And I would say that really, if we felt that way in our lives more, we would definitely feel more at peace. We definitely live in a very consumer-driven world these days, and we're marketed to in that way with products, that by having a certain product or achieving a certain lifestyle, that this is going to intrinsically make us happier. But I do believe, this is very cliche, that the sensation of peace and feeling grateful is definitely something that comes within. The momentarily high you get from purchasing something new or gaining something new is very quickly lost. It goes away quite quickly. And, we're dancing and chasing around for the next thing. And I think chasing is probably the correct word. The dopamine hit rush of having something new. Even if you've have an aspiration to have a certain, I don't know, it's a fancy car or something, it goes quite quickly. I mean, I'm definitely someone who enjoys nice things. I appreciate things that are built very well, aesthetically pleasing and beautiful. I really appreciate fine craftsmanship and things like that. But, when you have money and you purchase those things, I think that quickly goes. And I think then you're then looking for the next thing. So I think yogic practices definitely teach you to be more accepting of where you're at in your life, and feeling more at ease and more comfortable with feeling grateful for the things that you have. And I think that you could say that this would be a good intention for your yogic practices. When we practice, whether you're practicing the Ashtanga yoga system or my element series or other vinyasa yogic practices, meditative practices, gratefulness is definitely a huge part of learning faith-based practices. And I'm going to talk about faith a little bit later, where even in the Ashtanga yoga opening mantra, it's really about being grateful for the teachers that were there before you. Your teacher, the person prior to you that taught you that method. There's a gratefulness that's practiced from that, and that's something I definitely practice with my opening personal mantras, is around being grateful for the practices that I have, what I'm about to do on the mat. It's a very focused, intentional thing. And being grateful for feeling healthy and strong and alive. These are things you can practice daily, which is why I'm a believer in a daily ritualized practice, because that becomes embodied. It becomes a normal thing that you practice every day. Every morning, potentially, you are ritualizing gratefulness. You're ritualizing people in your life that you've had a connection with, that you're feeling a grateful feeling for. You're practicing Santosha. Yeah, this is why, aside from the physical benefits, I will advocate a daily practice, a ritualized, intentional focus of feeling grateful. This can do wonders for your mental health and relationships, feeling grateful for the love of your life, the partner in your life, your children potentially. It's easy to get caught up in the ups and downs of stressful modern day living, but ultimately, having sat with people on their deathbed, actually, I've had a few people in my life close to me die. I was sat by my father on his deathbed, and it's interesting what comes up in those spaces. And, most people would definitely have liked to have spent more time with the people that they love. And it's easy to neglect that. And I think ritualizing, practicing, feeling grateful for our loved ones is a win. Yeah, that's a big W, yeah? So, let's talk a little bit about faith. I think faith maybe is something that's being neglected in modern day living, or potentially a negative feeling towards traditional religions. But really, faith is something that I try to personally embody and teach in my practices, where let's word this in the correct way. You know what? Actually, yeah, I'm going to stick with this. Let's look at the definition of faith. Yeah, this will be a good one. Faith. How is it defined in the English dictionary? Complete trust or confidence in someone or something. While it's heavily associated with a strong religious belief, the concept applies equally to secular contexts. So basically, what we're talking about is having a general trust and confidence in something occurring. Now, the human mind definitely tries to have certainty. Life is not certain. Yeah, many things in life are not certain. The classic cliche of death and taxes could be one. But we have faith in certain things occurring in our life, and I think that we can feel a lot of joy when we have faith in aspects of our life, some kind of belief in something that is potentially beyond the physical, yeah? Now, I have faith in my yoga practice. I have faith in the system of Ashtanga yoga, for example, yeah? I have faith that I trust that system, and I trust the way it's designed, and I trust the teachers that I've had before me, and I trust myself in the way that I'm practicing, that I have a belief in something that's going to happen. I have trust in the ups and downs of this. I have trust in the way that this might not be a linear progression. I have faith that it's not going to go the way I want. It's not going to be how I want it to be every day. But I have faith that over time, I have confidence that this is going to lead to something positive. And my experience of practicing that has taught me that, yeah. You can apply that to almost anything in your life, yeah. It's quite common when you see some students practicing certain systems of yoga. They'll have the honeymoon phase where they start practicing, and they'll have these highs of the new teacher, the new room, everything's going good. They meet a roadblock, they meet some sort of tension, some sort of resistance, and they stop practicing, or they blame the teacher, they blame the space, they blame something in their body potentially, and they stop practicing. And, they lose faith, they lose belief in what's going on, and negative words, negative frames of mind come in where there's a reason for them to stop doing what they're doing. And I believe that this is through a lack of faith. This is through a lack of belief. This is the mind wanting things to be a certain way. Yeah, this goes back to Santosha, where you're not content with yourself. You're not content with the way things are. There's a problem, and you want to change it. And some things in life, I would say, most of the things that are more complex and are more relational are not going to be linear. Yeah, anytime you could ask any business owner or entrepreneur, this is not a steady linear progression. When I was learning martial arts, that was not a steady linear progression. There was lots of ups and downs, lots of plateaus. The same in any kind of loving relationship, yeah? You learn, you make mistakes, you change things, but ultimately you have faith and a belief that this is going to turn into something more positive, or it's going to change in a positive way. So you have more faith, and you're more accepting of the ups and downs, yeah? I believe that this is related to Santosha. The same with the Ashtanga yoga system. It's lots of ups and downs. Yeah, the body is not a machine. You're an organic, changing organism. You're different every day. Your practice is different every day. Your body's different every day. Your emotional state's different every day. And the mind wants everything to be the same. This left hemispheric way of looking at the world, I want it to be the same. I want it to be mechanical. And if it's not, something's wrong. This is a delusional way to look at reality, a more holistic way to look at reality, using the right hemisphere of your brain, going again back to McGilchrist's work, is more accepting. It sees the bigger picture. It sees the nuances of things. It sees that, okay, if I look at this as a longer project, it's understandable that things are going to change, and it's understandable that things aren't going to go my way. It's not going to be exactly how I want. A good example is, for example, I have some students learning Kapotasana at the moment, which is a very deep back bend in the Ashtanga yoga system. You have to have faith to practice that posture. Yeah, you have to have a belief and faith in the system and the teacher that you're practicing with, that this will work itself out. Yeah, you have to also be a little bit pig-headed and a little bit determined and maybe stubborn, but this is also a good virtue. This is something to practice. It's not terrible being a little bit stubborn. We get things done by not quitting, by not giving up, by having faith that, okay, if I do this consistently, if I keep chipping away, my body will change, my nervous system will adapt, and eventually this new form will take place and that will be integrated. And that's a true statement for most practitioners. But if you don't have faith, if you don't trust the path that you're on, you're going to find faults with that, and then you're going to be out of Santosha. You're going to be out of acceptance. You're going to be in a negative frame of mind where you're being critical, and this is wrong for me. My arms are too short, my body's too big. All of the things that stop people from learning body movement, they quit. And when they quit, they start to blame something, and they're not content anymore. They don't like to be uncomfortable. Yeah, I would say that a good practice of Santosha is learning to be okay when you're uncomfortable. This I've talked about many times on this podcast. I would say is a superpower in some ways, and I would say that you definitely learn that having faith in the Ashtanga yoga system, is that you become very adept and comfortable with being uncomfortable, and you trust the growing pains and the changes of being uncomfortable, and you come out different. There's a transformation that goes on. There's a kind of metamorphosis that goes on within your nervous system and body, and you're different. You're new. You come out different. Your nervous system changes. Your whole being is shifted into a different state. But this has to come from a space of having faith and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And really what I'm trying to be specific about on this is trusting the path. Yeah, I believe that a lot of people feel uncomfortable in life and they don't feel satisfied, or they feel not content, is when they don't trust their intuition. Yeah, as I've said many times on this podcast, when you trust your intuition, it means that you feel in line with your decision making. Yeah, whether this is work, relationships, yogic practices, whatever it is. If you feel like you're making decisions that come from your heart and your gut, and you feel completely in line with a decision that you make, and you know it's coming from a good place, you are accepting and have faith of the path that you are on. You're much more in a space of Santosha. You're much more in a space of feeling acceptance and satisfied, even when it's not going well. Yeah. When you love your partner and you know that they're a good person and you know you have a good connection together, you trust the ups and downs. You don't necessarily, okay, it's not working this week. This relationship's over. I don't like this person anymore. They're toxic. I need to get them out of my life. That could be true, but there are lots of ups and downs in the best relationships. There's lots of ups and downs in the Ashtanga yoga system. If you're a business owner or whatever your job is, there's lots of ups and downs through that process. But if you have faith in the decision you made to go down that path, and you believe that's the right path for you, you're more accepting of when it's not going the way you want. And then you're practicing Santosha, yeah? I believe one of the biggest benefits of having an authentic yoga practice is cultivating your intuition. When you're in line with your intuition, the lows aren't so low, yeah? you're not so critical of things when they're not going your way. When you're losing money, or the hours of your job are not perfect, or whatever's going on that you could easily define as wrong or bad or not going your way, or your hips are sore, or your whatever, you had to drop a posture for some months in the Ashtanga Yoga system. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just that you feel you're on the right path and you're like, well, actually, I have faith in this. I'm good. I'm just going to keep pursuing this, keep chipping away and see what happens. This to me is usually where the most profound change happens within a practitioner, and I've experienced this in myself, by being consistent and being okay with being uncomfortable. And again, this has to come from an intuitive space, because if you're in a job that you hate because intuitively you knew it wasn't right for you, maybe you took it for someone else, maybe you made a decision to be there for someone else, you're going to build resentment and you're not going to feel that you're on the right path. Same with relationships, the same with your yoga practice. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a lot about why you choose the things you do and being accountable, yeah? Ultimately, no one forces you to do anything. If you take full accountability and responsible for your decision making and your actions, it's only really you that can decide to change something. And that comes from within. Accountability and being honest with ourselves, again, is an authentic yoga practice where we take full accountability and responsible for our lives. Something I'll continue with that is, maybe I can just say it like this. Everyone, I believe, is exactly where they should be. And it's hard to accept that sometimes, especially when things aren't going your way. The decisions you made prior to being to where you are in your life have led you to be exactly where you're meant to be. Even when you're in the worst periods of your life, as with most difficult periods of your life, they're usually where you learn the most about yourself. And when you look back on that and you reflect on that, it's usually something you're grateful for. When you take full accountability and responsibility for the actions you take, even the worst things that can happen to you in your life, you will usually look as something positive. You would have learned something, you would have grown from it, and it would have shifted you. The universe would have forced you into another way of being for you to look at something differently. This is how I approach life. This is what yoga has taught me, really, as a way to approach life. The Ashtanga yoga system has also helped me with this, where it's easy to be a victim, yeah? It's easy to blame other people and shift responsibility onto other people to where we are at in our life. I personally haven't really grown from thinking that way, and it hasn't benefited me whatsoever. What's benefited me the most is taking full accountability and responsibility for my actions and where I'm at in my life, and using those failures, using those, hiccups along the path as faith. Yeah, I have complete faith in my decision making. I have complete faith, without getting too airy-fairy, but in a way, of the universe. When I think about sunyata and bandha, which I've talked about a lot on this podcast, so go and check those out. It's an energy thing, yeah? If I have a goal in my life, or we talk about different friends or students where they have certain goals, again, that path can be rocky, yeah? But usually we learn something from those experiences, and I feel like often the universe will, call it what you want. Universe, we could call it however type of energetic form that you want to think about this. Sometimes you can feel like you're being pushed in a certain direction. Sometimes you feel like you're being uncomfortably pushed into a certain direction. Personally, that resistance and that push, when you look back on those periods, you're grateful for it. Yeah, that resistance that made you change that job, that resistance that made you potentially leave that relationship, that resistance that made forced you to look at your life in a different way and change something. Change comes from resistance. Resistance is not a bad thing. Everything happens in this universe through friction, resistance, and pressure. Yeah? It's how we respond to it. Yeah? This analogy of moving like water. Yeah? When you feel something's blocked, when something's like a rock and it's pushing you a certain way, there's normally a reason for that. Yeah? We have to learn how to listen. I believe yogic practices teach you how to listen to that. Yeah. Call it the universe, call it intuition, call it God. I feel like when you focus on certain things in your life, those things start to become reality. And the path towards that reality usually comes with a lot of resistance. When we're not practicing Santosha, that resistance is a negative thing. We blame someone else, we blame the external world. We feel like we're just being pushed and pulled and it's not going our way. We're not in line with things. But if you look at it as a longer journey, usually that resistance is a positive thing. It forces you to change your perception of reality. It forces you to look at your life in a different way. It forces you to question your job. It forces you to question things. It forces you to look at things and change things. This, to me, is an authentic yogic path where you're assessing things, you're being critical, but you have faith. Yeah, you have faith in the path that you're choosing because you're in line with your intuition. Yeah, your intuition will talk to you often and give you feedback on where your life is going and the choices that you're making. It's up to you whether you decide to listen or not. Whether you listen or not comes down to fear. Yeah, no good decision, in my opinion, is made out of fear, which is why in my own life, it's the thing that I challenge the most. Yeah, fear is a blockage to change. Yeah, it doesn't like change. Your ego doesn't like change. The body, the mind generally doesn't like too much change, and there's resistance to change, and it's really what we do with things, which is why it's important to understand what your intention with things are. If you trust your intention, you trust the path you're on, you're more accepting of change and you're more likely to feel satisfied in accepting those changes and knowing that it's part of the path that you're on. And that path is going to lead you to good things, even though it doesn't feel right at the time. I think this is a very difficult thing for people to navigate, is to trust that you're making the right decisions. I think the scariest periods of my life have been when I didn't trust my decision making. And when you're not, if you don't have faith or trust in why you choose certain things, I think that's quite a scary place for people to be in. And if you're someone that feels like that in your life, integrate a daily yoga practice. Integrate a ritualized, intentional daily yoga practice, because this will cultivate intuition. You won't be looking for external people to tell you what to do. You'll know what to do. Yeah, that is the ultimate confidence you can have. It's the ultimate feeling of Santosha, where you're completely in line with yourself and you have full confidence in your decision making that isn't coming from a place of arrogance. There's a very big difference between being arrogant and feeling confident. To me, these are the biggest gains that you get from having an authentic yoga practice. Yeah, it's great to get flexible and strong and all of those bodily things health-wise that we get from having a consistent yoga practice. But trust in yourself, faith and trust in your intuition and your decision making is gold standard. You know, to me, that has been one of the biggest things my yoga practice has given me, and having faith and in my decision making. You know, the body and the mind craves comfort. Yeah, I think it's kind of like again, the ego doesn't like too much change, and we're very much drawn to feeling comfortable and safe. And I think that this is a natural thing, and it's good to feel like that. But again, your intuition and your decision making will usually take you out of that quite often, and I think it's quite normal for people and practitioners who are listening to their intuition to make quite big life changes, maybe every 10 years or so. I think this is something I've observed in myself and other people. Usually around the 10-year mark, you get quite big changes that go on in people's lives. And I think that this isn't a negative thing. This is something where something comes up, there's a necessary change that has to happen. And, we can either let fear take over and we're scared to make a change and we get too comfortable. And we kind of know when we're doing that, really, and we stop listening to that inner voice and we fall into some sort of negative habits. And then some of us will go into that change and listen to that intuitive voice and start making some changes in our life. And I think that really leads to us living our best life, where we feel like we're still following our path, even though it might not be what we thought it would be. Yeah, often I've looked at my own personal life and thought, how the fuck did I end up here? But there isn't really a straight arrow plan. It's just you make changes as you go along and you listen to your intuition and you end up in places and doing things that you never thought you would do. But it's just following that voice. I think living life in that way is slightly scary, but it's also extremely rewarding. I'll just give a quick story on that before I jump into some other aspects, because I think this is a very simple story from sort of Zen and Buddhism that kind of conveys how we might deal with changes in our life. I remember reading a story of a farmer in China in many hundreds of years ago who had a horse. And one day the horse escaped from the stable and went missing. So the people in the village said, oh, it must be really sad because you've lost your favorite horse, and, what are you going to do? And his answer was, these things happen. Sometimes just that's the way it is. 3 days later, his favorite horse returns with a new friend, a stallion, a very prized, beautiful stallion that comes back into his stable. And the villagers commented on this like, oh my God, you've got such good fortune. Aren't you really happy that you have this new stallion in your stable? And his answer was the same, sometimes these things happen. It's interesting what can change. His only son, a few days later, takes this new stallion for a ride in the countryside and unfortunately falls off the horse and breaks his leg. The villagers comment, aren't you distraught? This is a terrible thing that happened to you. How do you feel about it? His answer was the same. Sometimes these things happen. A few weeks later, a war breaks out in ancient China, and all of the young men are forced to sign up to the army and go to the front line. But the farmer's son, who just broke his leg, was alleviated from this duty because he was not fit to fight, and he was the only man in the village that wasn't led into war. The villager says, aren't you lucky? You must be so grateful that your only son isn't going to war. And his answer was, that's just the way it is sometimes. And really the parable, this story is just, there's so many ups and downs, and some things often at times feel like the worst thing is happening. But usually if we're patient and we let the story of our lives unfold and you look back, you can see there's a pathway there. The negative thing that felt terrible at the time, if we don't react so strongly, usually leads to something positive, even though it feels like the worst thing at the time. And again, I think my Ashtanga yoga practice helped teach me this. It helped teach me that what feels bad at the time, with enough patience and with enough allowance of belief in what I'm doing, it will usually lead to something positive. And again, if you feel like you're in line with your intuition, you will trust that path. Yeah, even when something bad is going on. I think this is a good story that simply explains this to us, and I think we can all see that in our own lives if we look back at those moments. Um, One other thing we could talk about with Santosha is really around attachment to material things. I think that this is something we all struggle with. I've had periods of my life with having absolutely nothing, and I've had periods of my life of having lots of material wealth and things like that. And I wouldn't say I was happier in either or. I think they have their own feelings and sensations. But I think that generally, if we think about attachment to something, it's usually around the fear of losing something. Something that I think my yoga practice has taught me is to be more accepting of loss and losing things. As I've said before, I've lost three of the closest people I've ever had in my life in the last 10 years. My ex-partner, we were together for around 13 years. Unfortunately, she passed away. My mother and father have both died in the last 10 years. It's definitely taught me a lot around loss and just really the way life is, the way life is. And we lose things. People lose, people go, the people that are closest to us, our loved ones, pass away. And this is a natural aspect of life. And I think that if we're too attached to material things, if we have this energy of trying to keep everything for ourselves, I think this hardens us and it makes our acceptance of the inevitability of death harder. I remember someone told me once, yoga helps you with health, but really it prepares you for death. And I believe that to be true. What I've mostly experienced in my yoga practice is loss, actually. It's much more around losing things. I've definitely, every year that goes past, every decade, I become much more accepting of losing things. And I think that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that when we are too attached to the material things in our lives, our mind gets very, very fixated on what we see as a material thing rather than something that is impermanent. Again, going back to classic Buddhism and sunyata, potentially this is the ultimate delusion that we are in this permanent state, permanent fixated body, and that when that goes, there is nothing else. There's just this blackness. I don't believe that to be true whatsoever. From my own meditative experiences, I believe that to be delusional. So I think yogic practices, in particular Buddhism, teaches us that we aren't these permanent fixed objects. And I believe this encourages Santosha. This encourages an acceptance and a belief in the mystery of life. Life is a beautiful mystery. We don't really 100% know what goes on, but becoming more accepting of losing everything, and I mean losing everything by the ultimate loss, which is your life, makes us feel more at ease. It makes us feel more at peace. It makes us feel much more at ease with the reality of losing things and losing our life. And I think that this makes people more calm. There's an intrinsic peace that's felt in the body, being connected to this non-physical form. Yeah. If you're interested to understand more about this, I'll talk about this a lot in the podcast on sunyata around emptiness. Everything in our world exists because of our interaction with it. Yeah, we are not individually solo, free flowing through life. That everything exists in our form. So sometimes, if you feel you're not in the right place, try to think that nothing around you would exist without you there. I kind of play with this sometimes daily, where any interaction I have with someone where I live in Oslo, you can feel. Let's get into that quickly. Living in a foreign country, being in a different place, sometimes you can feel a bit unrooted and like you don't belong in different places. But really, if you think about it from an energetic level, every interaction you have with someone happens because you're there. Yeah, that there's a reason you're there. There's a flow to that state. Every kind of connection you make, everything you see and observe is happening because of your interaction and observation with it. When you look at life more in that way, everything generally just to me feels a little bit more magical and a little bit more mysterious, and understanding that you kind of are in the right place all the time. And to be connected to that is a really beautiful feeling. You feel more embodied, you feel more present, you feel more accepting of where you are, understanding that all of these things are existing around you because of your interaction with this. Yeah? Your interaction with the world and life is what creates the reality of what you're experiencing. Again, to me, this is one of the best things that's learnt in Buddhism that is often explained in modern science around the material world, and how what we see is down to our observation and our interaction with this. And I think that when we embodied with that and connected to that, we feel more at peace. We feel like we're in the right place, we're on the right path. Intuitively, when you feel you're moving through the world intuitively, this feels good. You feel alive. You feel, yeah, I'm exactly where I should be. Yeah, that's a very peaceful feeling, and it definitely encourages the feeling of Santosha. I've got a short story maybe just on this around materialism, and I think we've all felt this, but I remember reading a story about a monk who had a wooden bowl that he used to drink and eat from, and he was very satisfied with this bowl. There was no need to change it. It was fine as it was. But going through a market one day, he saw this bowl made of this kind of fancy glass and shiny metal and jewels and things like this. And the store owner, because they were friends and he'd done a lot of alming in the area and he was a very kind of well-known monk, he gave him this fancy bowl to replace his wooden bowl that he would enjoy drinking and eating from this bowl because it was so aesthetically pleasing. So the monk, put his wooden bowl away and started using this nice, shiny, new, luxurious bowl. And as the weeks went by, what he noticed was that he became more and more stressed about using it. He was afraid of dropping it. He was afraid of scratching it. And ultimately, he was afraid of it being stolen. So he always kept it on him, never let anyone else use it. And he guarded it, you could say. And what he realized was that this was totally taking him of his um, out of Santosha. It was taking him out of feeling relaxed. His mind was much more in a fearful state around loss and protecting something. So he gave the bowl back to the market owner and went back to his trusty wooden bowl, and he felt more at peace, more at ease. And I think this is a good example of the choices that we make. Yeah, it's nice to have nice things, and it's nice to have certain things. And again, I appreciate beauty, I appreciate build quality and things like that. But if it's taking you out of your yogic state, if it's taking you out of your relaxed, calm state, really, what's the point? Yeah, especially nowadays with the way things are with in certain cities with things being stolen and things like that. I mean, sometimes it's probably not even worth it. If you've got a nice Rolex watch, but you don't really show it because you're afraid of it being stolen on the street, I mean, why not sell it and get rid of it? I mean, what's the point of having it if you're just so fearful of it being lost? So I think there's aspects of materialism like that definitely take you out of these more centered spaces where you're afraid of losing things, or maybe you're working an awful job to pay for this luxurious lifestyle that you kind of hate potentially. I think it's good for us to assess how much materialism do we need for us to feel content. Yeah, and I think that's different for everyone. Okay, I don't think money is inherently bad. I think it's more about the way it makes us feel. And again, Santosha, how um, accepting and how content are we with our lives? Is our materialism making ourselves more stressed and unhappy to maintain it? I think that's something that yoga helps us assess, to know whether we're consuming too much. And again, this comes back to bandha. Again, I'm not against money, and it's different for everyone, but like most things, too much of anything can lead to something negative. Not enough of something can, lead to us feeling not at ease. Being completely broke is not fun. Maybe having too much wealth where we're fearful and stressed all the time is also not good. Again, it's banda. I think it's up to us to find that middle ground where we're balancing those energies out, where money and wealth feel good, but it's not taking us into this stressed, anxious, fearful state. Being broke is not fun, not having enough money for food and shelter and some basic amenities is not good at all. Some of us like to travel more, some of us enjoy some of the finer things in life. I think I'm not against that whatsoever. You don't have to be a Buddhist monk just eating from a wooden bowl. Some of us enjoy nice things. I think that's all right. I think it's just how we approach it. And again, finding that middle ground. But maybe I've said enough about this, but maybe what I might say lastly on this is around pleasure. Yeah, I would say that tantric practices in Buddhism teach us that pleasure is a good thing. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. I think seeking pleasure and feeling happy and feeling loving should be our default state. Yeah, I would say that when we're happiest is when we feel like that. Yeah, feeling love, having pleasure in our life, and we can feel that whenever we want. Yeah, joy. These are things that we seek out in our lives. But I think that if this is too determined by what's going on externally from us, I think this is when it leads into this kind of chasing element. And I think that if we're chasing pleasure and we're chasing things to externally make us happy, this is when it takes us, out of our center. And I think that generally, when I've met people that are largely led by chasing pleasure, what are you going to do for that? Yeah, we have to have, in my belief system, in my faith systems in yogic practices, is that truth and integrity is your baseline. Yeah, if you're seeking pleasure where it takes you out of your truth and integrity, this is the failure of your yogic practices. I think this is a failure within us all, where lying and being deceitful and chasing pleasure is goes beyond your moral code and your moral compass. I've talked about this a little bit on some previous episodes, and I'm saying this because I'm talking a lot about pleasure and feeling good and finding this bandha and this middle ground, but this shouldn't be based on lies and deceit and chasing that. Yeah, I think this is something that Buddha talked about extensively, is the sensations of chasing. You're chasing something external to make you feel good. You don't have that intrinsically within yourself. So if you're being led by that, if your sensations of desperation for feeling some sort of feel good, I think that leads to a lot of negative actions where the five poisons start to come into place: greed, and lying, and the parts of our personality that fall out of bandha, where we lose our integrity. Lying becomes normalized, and we start going away from our baseline of being truthful and having integrity. I'm just saying this we need to be mindful how much we're being driven by pleasure. We don't want to be led by falsehoods and avoiding truth. And again, an authentic yoga practice will highlight your truthfulness on a daily basis. It will highlight what's under the surface and what's really there. And we can choose whether to believe delusions or whether to be embodied in a truthful state. But I might leave that there. I think I've touched on most of the aspects of this that I probably needed to. But ultimately, just to finish, I would say intuition. I think intuition is the key to Santosha. Intuition is a faith into something beyond the physical world. It's not something you're going to learn on a podcast. You're not going to learn this from uh, some tech science bro. This is something that comes from within. I think true wisdom and really knowing that you're on the right path is an answer that you give yourself. And it comes from God. This is what I would describe as God. Intuition to me is God. It's listening to something that you don't really understand, but you trust it implicitly. And I think that, again, an authentic yoga practice is what cultivates that. And this really comes back to truth. Yeah. If you're in line with your intuition and you really know yourself fully, you know why you're making decisions. Yeah. If you're making decisions where you're not being truthful to yourself and you're lying to yourself out of fear, this is when things start to go amiss. Yeah. This is when we start chasing pleasures for wrong reasons. Lies start coming in, our integrity starts to kind of fold, and things, we're out of balance, we're out of banda, we're off the good path, we're on a negative path that I would say potentially is more destructive. So really, when you're in line with your intuition, this is generally in line with truth. Yeah. When you're out of your intuition, this is coming from fear or some sort of lies and something that we're being delusional. This is why we have to get to the bottom of who we are. To understand who we really are is to be completely honest with yourself. When you're completely honest with yourself, you will know why you choose certain things. You will take accountability completely for the choices that you make, and you will not lie to yourself. This is the cornerstone to an authentic yoga practice. This is why I talk about this a lot in this podcast, is the pursuit of truth. Not in necessarily even from a moralistic standpoint, but just to know yourself fully, to truthfully know why you think the way you do, why the choices that you make, and whether you choose to listen to your intuition or not. I think I might leave it there. Ciao.